So our mission today is to dig into this detailed document, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. We want to help you understand not just what guarantees are, but how they specifically function, how they secure commitments, prevent financial loss, ensure fairness, in all sorts of situations. From traditional agreements right through to complex modern financial transactions. We're going to show you how this topic, which might seem a bit dense at first glance, is actually brimming with practical wisdom and honestly surprising clarity. So let's start right at the beginning. When we talk about guarantees, what are we actually referring to at their core?
Right. At their heart, guarantees are basically mechanisms. They're specifically designed to secure obligations, yeah, and prevent debts from being lost or, delayed. Think of them as a fundamental safety net. It's there to ensure that if the primary obligation falters, there's a clear, established path to fulfillment. And what's really insightful about this standard, I think, is how carefully it maps out what's okay versus what's forbidden among different guarantee types. It also draws a crucial line between what it calls guaranteed items, which are essentially obligations like debts and trusts, or amana.
Ah, amana.
Right, exactly. And that distinction is vital because a trust, well, by its nature, it implies careful safekeeping, not direct liability, unless certain conditions are breached.
Okay, that distinction alone clarifies quite a bit about how these tools are meant to be used. And the standard also points out what's outside its scope, doesn't it? Like guarantees for destruction or crimes.
Precisely. It doesn't cover guarantees related to, say, destruction, criminal acts, or usurpation. It keeps its focus squarely on financial and contractual obligations. It's about securing a promise, fundamentally not punishing a wrong. And in terms of broad application, the standard confirms that guarantees are generally permissible. They play a huge role in validating contracts, upholding rights, which is, fundamental to any stable financial system. You'll find it's perfectly all right to stipulate guarantees in what are called commutative contracts.
Where there's a direct exchange, like a sale.
Exactly, where there's a direct exchange of value, sale, loan, that sort of thing. In fact, you can even sort of stack the deck, you could say, obtain more than one guarantee for a single obligation.
Right. Layer them up for more security. That makes perfect sense for typical commercial deals. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think. What about guarantees in trust contracts? My understanding is generally things like sponsorship kafala or a pledge ran aren't allowed there. Why is that? And are there exceptions?
You've hit on a really key point. In trust contracts, where someone is entrusted with something for safekeeping or maybe investment without necessarily incurring liability if it's lost, it's generally not permissible to stipulate kafala or ran.
Okay.
This is because the core nature of a trust contract implies no inherent risk for the trustee unless they've acted improperly. However, and this is where the crucial exceptions come in and guarantees can be introduced if there's clear transgression or negligence or maybe a violation of pre-agreed conditions by that trustee.
So it's about protecting against bad faith.
Precisely. It's about safeguarding against misconduct, not trying to undermine the trust itself. That's a really powerful principle.
It is. And speaking of specific scenarios, the standard also touches on unique situations, like combining kafala and agency in one contract or guarantees for lease assets.
Yes, exactly. For instance, in a lease, the guarantee for the asset itself, that actually falls on the owner, not the lessee. Again, unless those specific breaches happen, transgression, negligence, violation of conditions, and the lessor also carries the burden of damage costs and insurance for the asset, it really reinforces that idea of responsibility aligning with ownership.
Okay. Now, for any financial agreement to really hold water, it needs a solid foundation. And in this world of guarantees, that foundation seems to be all about the rules of engagement, particularly around documentation and witnessing. How critical are these?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The standard is crystal clear here. Documenting financial transactions through writing is explicitly mandated.
Not just suggested.
Not just a suggestion. No, it's a requirement. And while, customary forms of writing are acceptable, which shows some flexibility, there's a very strict ethical component. It's strictly forbidden to destroy, conceal, or forge these documents. This isn't just red tape. It's about building and maintaining unwavering trust and accountability. And hand in hand with documentation is witnessing. Witnessing financial dealings is also mandated. Bearing witness when you're called upon is strongly encouraged. In fact, performing it when it's truly needed actually becomes an obligation.
Wow.
And on the flip side, false testimony is explicitly forbidden. And critically, this documentation and witnessing It's not permitted for transactions that are themselves forbidden. You can't use these tools to legitimize something illegitimate.
Right. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that transparency and integrity aren't just, nice ideas. They are truly at the core of secure financial dealings. It's not just about getting the paperwork done. It's about making sure every step builds trust, sets up clear accountability, and proactively prevents future disputes. It's about designing a system where clarity is king. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and unpack two of the most foundational mechanisms within this world. Kafala, which is sponsorship or suretyship, and Ron, the pledge. Starting with Kafala. It sounds remarkably flexible.
It really is. An institution can require one sponsor, or even more than one, and the kafala itself can be tied to a specific time period, or it can have an upper limit on the amount sponsored. It can even be restricted by a condition, or maybe suspended pending a condition being met. Lots of options.
And what about the guarantor's rights? Can they back out?
That's fascinating, actually. A guarantor can withdraw from their kafala obligation, but only before the debt they're sponsoring fully arises.
Okay, before it kicks in.
Exactly. But there's a key condition. They absolutely must provide proper and timely notification to the creditor. You can't just leave them hanging.
Sure, that makes sense.
And if the guarantor incurs legitimate costs in providing the kafala, maybe travel administrative stuff, they have the right to recover those actual expenses.
Got it. And there are different types of kafala, with or without recourse.
Yes, the standard clarifies two main types. One where the guarantor has the right to go back to the original debtor for reimbursement, that's with recourse, and one where they don't. And here's a crucial point. It's generally forbidden for a financial institution to undertake kafala without that right of recourse.
Why is that?
Well, unless they're specifically set up for purely charitable purposes, it prevents them from essentially giving away capital in a way that could undermine their own financial stability. It maintains prudence.
Oh, wow.
And maybe even more critically, it's explicitly forbidden to charge or pay fees just for the act of kafala itself.
Right. You mentioned that distinction before.
Yes, and it's fundamental. This isn't just a technical rule, it's a profound ethical stance. Imagine if a promise of help, a guarantee, could just be bought and sold like a product. This standard ensures that the act of guaranteeing, especially something like kafala, which has strong moral undertones, stays distinct from purely commercial transactions. It underlines that trust and mutual support aren't commodities.
That really drives home the principle, doesn't it? A guarantee secures an obligation. It doesn't become a product itself.
Okay, so what about guaranteeing something that's not yet known or not yet due? Like a future liability. Is that possible?
Yes, that's entirely permissible. It's fine to guarantee debts that aren't yet due, like a guarantee of liability for something that might arise down the line.
Like performance bonds, maybe?
Could be something like that, yes. And similar to other kafala arrangements, this kind of guarantee can also be withdrawn before the liability actually materializes, again, with proper notice. It allows for future planning without locking parties in forever.
Okay. And practically speaking, what does kafala mean for the creditor?
Well, it gives the creditor quite a bit of flexibility. They can demand payment from either the original debtor or the guarantor.
Either one.
Either one. Now, an interesting nuance. If the creditor decides to absolve only the guarantor, the debtor's liability actually remains unchanged.
Oh. However, if the debtor is absolved, then the guarantor is also automatically absolved because their obligation is tied directly to the debtors.
Makes sense. The debt itself is gone.
Exactly. And the guarantor, when they do pay up, can claim reimbursement for the amount they actually paid, even if that amount was less than the full sum initially guaranteed.
Only what they paid out.
Only what they actually paid. And kafala, it can be a standalone contract or it can be integrated into a bigger lending agreement. Very versatile.
That flexible yet principled approach seems key. Now, one fascinating prohibition you touched on earlier was about institutions guaranteeing currency fluctuations in mudaraba or mushaga operations. Why is that specific thing forbidden?
Yes, that raises a very important question. It really gets to the absolute core of risk sharing in Islamic finance. See, mudaraba, that's a speculative partnership, and mushaka participatory financing, they are fundamentally designed on the principle of shared profit and shared loss.
Right, the risk is shared.
The risk is shared. If an institution were to guarantee against currency fluctuations or, frankly, any investment loss in these structures, it would completely undermine the very essence of that shared risk. It's like saying, okay, we're partners in this volatile investment, but don't worry, I'll make sure you never feel the downside. That's just not a true partnership.
It negates the risk element.
It negates the risk element for one party, yes. And similarly, if an institution stipulated such a guarantee in, say, an investment agency contract, they can't then use that as leverage to force the client into something or just terminate the contract unilaterally. It's all about protecting the integrity of genuine risk sharing.
That's a crucial safeguard. Ensures real partnership, real risk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so beyond sponsorship, kafala, the other big tool is RON, the pledge. You described it as a tangible safety net. Let's dig into that.
Exactly. RON or pledge. It's when a financial asset or something equivalent in value is put up as security for a debt. The basic understanding is that if repayment becomes impossible, the debt can then be recovered from the value of that specific pledged asset.
So it's having a concrete physical backup.
Precisely. A tangible backup could be property, could be valuable items, shares perhaps that provides real assurance the debt won't just disappear into thin air if the debtor defaults.
Okay, that makes perfect sense in theory. Now, let's bridge that gap and see where this theory really meets practice. Let's look at some of the more modern applications of these guaranteed principles. A common one many of us might see is the acceleration of installments.
Right, accelerating payments. It's a common clause, isn't it, in lots of contracts. Shari'ah Standard Number 5 says, yes, you can speed up the remaining payments if someone defaults on a deferred sale.
Like missing a car payment, for example.
Exactly. But, and this is crucial, it's not meant to be a sudden ambush. The debtor must be notified first, and they have to be given a fair grace period to try and fix the situation, to catch up.
Okay, there's a process.
There's a process. And here's another key safeguard. If the default happened because of something genuinely unavoidable, a natural disaster, a major unforeseen crisis, what lawyers call force majeure, then this acceleration might not even apply.
Protection for things truly outside their control.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining balance and fairness even when things unfortunately go wrong.
That's a vital protection for the debtor. What about letters of guarantee? Logs. They're everywhere in modern finance. I understand there are very specific rules about the fees involved.
Yes, very specific. With letters of guarantee, it's strictly forbidden to charge fees just for the act of guaranteeing, whether there's collateral involved or not.
Regardless of cover.
Regardless of cover. This echoes that core principle we talked about. You don't commodify the guarantee itself.
Right.
However, what is permitted is charging reasonable administrative and service fees. These have to be justifiable. They can't exceed the customary fees for the actual work involved in processing, managing, and issuing the log.
So pay for the work, not the promise.
Exactly. It's about legitimate compensation for services rendered, not for the underlying promise or guarantee.
That's a very clear line in the sand. And speaking of bank promises, let's pivot to something absolutely critical in international trade.
Yeah.
Documentary credit. How does that fit in?
Documentary credit, a cornerstone of global trade. Imagine you're importing goods from, say, halfway across the world.
Okay.
You don't really want to pay until you know the goods are actually shipped and meet the agreed specifications, right?
Natural.
And the seller. They don't want to ship those goods until they're sure they'll get paid. Big trust gap.
Big time.
Documentary credit, as defined by Shari'ah Standard Number 5, essentially acts as a bank's ironclad promise to pay the seller. But, and this is key, it's conditioned on something very specific. All the agreed-upon documents.
Like shipping manifests, inspection certificates.
Exactly. Bills of lading, all of that. They must perfectly match the terms laid out in the credit agreement. If the documents match, the bank pays.
So the documents are the trigger.
The documents are the key. It's a fundamental security layer that allows legitimate transactions to flow smoothly, building immense trust in these complex, often long-distance global dealings.
It really makes global trade feasible. Okay, what about simpler forms of security, like just using checks or promissory notes? Is that allowed?
Yes, it's permissible to obtain checks or promissory notes from the debtor as a form of security. They act as a tangible assurance.
Kind of like holding on to something.
Exactly. These are then simply returned to the debtor once the payment is made in full. Or, if there's a default, they can be used for collection purposes. Crucially, though, the standard adds that the holder, usually the institution, should provide an undertaking not to use these instruments except for the timely and proper recovery of the exact dues. No adding extra charges or interest through them.
Prevents misuse.
Precisely. Prevents abuse of these tools.
Okay. And on securing debts with cash, the standard makes a really interesting distinction about freezing balances, doesn't it, between investment and current accounts.
Yes, this is a great example of the standard's really thoughtful, practical approach. An institution can require freezing an investment account or stopping withdrawals from it.
Or limiting them.
Or, ideally, limiting withdrawals to just the outstanding debt amount. That's preferred. Why? Because an investment account often holds funds that are already understood to be engaged in some level of risk or longer-term commitment.
Right.
However, it takes a much, much softer approach with a current account, essentially your day-to-day checking account.
Right.
You cannot require freezing a current account as part of a lending contract unless it's done entirely voluntarily by the client.
The client has to agree.
Yes. The underlying principle seems to be protecting an individual's basic access to funds needed for daily living expenses, distinguishing that sharply from capital set aside for investment.
That's a really important consumer protection element, actually. Okay, another fascinating area is where a third party, someone outside the main deal, might pledge to cover potential investment losses. How does that work?
Yes, it's possible. A third party can step in and pledge to cover investment losses. However, and this is absolutely crucial, this pledge must not be linked contractually to the underlying mudaraba or investment agency contract itself.
They have to be separate things.
They have to be formally separate. This raises an important question, right? Why the separation?
Yeah, why?
It's all about maintaining the integrity of the original investment's nature. The third-party pledge is viewed as a distinct, voluntary act, maybe benevolence, maybe support, but it's separate. This ensures it doesn't accidentally transform the core investment contract from a genuine risk-sharing venture into some kind of guaranteed return, because that would contradict its fundamental Islamic finance principles.
Got it. Keeps the original contract pure, in a sense. What about subscription guarantees for shares, like in an IPO?
That's permissible too. An institution can commit to subscribing to any shares left over in an offering at the offered price. And here's the key point again. They cannot charge a separate fee specifically for this guarantee of subscription.
No fee for the guarantee itself.
No fee for the guarantee itself. However, the party making that commitment, the underwriter, perhaps can receive a fee for the work done. The administrative effort, the underwriting process itself, managing the subscription, but not for the guarantee part.
That distinction again. Service versus guarantee.
Exactly. And importantly, the client involved still receives the profit from their account after the institution takes its legitimate share as a mudarib speculative partner, if that's how the deal is structured.
Okay. Lastly, let's touch on guarantees in bids and tenders, and also earnest money or down payments. How are those handled?
Sure. In auctions or competitive tenders, it's perfectly permissible to obtain guarantees. This can include things like initial participation fees, bid bonds, which help ensure only serious bidders participate, and also amounts paid by the winning bidder as a form of commitment. This logic extends to earnest money, or arboon, in sales or leases.
Arboon?
It's permissible for the potential buyer or lessee to pay an earnest amount when the contract is initially concluded. If the contract then proceeds and isn't canceled during any agreed option period, this amount just becomes part of the total price or rent.
And if they back out?
If they back out during the auction period, then traditionally it's forfeited to the seller or lessor.
Okay, but I remember reading something interesting here. There's a nuance. If that earnest money is way more than any actual damage suffered by the seller.
Absolutely. This really shows the ethical core shining through. While earnest money can generally be forfeited if the buyer cancels, the standard strongly suggests the institution should ideally waive or return any portion of that earnest money that exceeds the actual damages the seller incurred because of the cancellation.
So you can't profit excessively from the forfeiture.
Exactly. Amounts taken as guarantees, especially if they go beyond compensating for actual damages, are treated more like a trust and amana rather than true earnest money that can just be kept freely.
So it becomes a trust again.
It takes on the characteristic of a trust. This means it cannot be kept except to cover those actual demonstrable damages. And here's another clever point. With the client's consent, these excess amounts held in trust can even be invested for the client.
Oh, interesting.
It's all about fairness, preventing unjust enrichment and making practical use of funds.
Very practical.
And just briefly on the final point about priority and tracking, an institution generally has the right to reclaim specific assets from a bankrupt person's property, provided those assets haven't fundamentally changed ownership or form. They also have the right to kind of track a guaranteed asset if the person holding it is doing something that might jeopardize the institution's ability to recover its due from that asset. And importantly, in a bankruptcy or liquidation scenario, creditors who hold a pledge, REN, generally have priority over ordinary unsecured creditors when it comes to getting paid from that pledged asset. And the people managing the liquidation also get paid first for their work. It just establishes a clear pecking order.
Got it. Establishes the order of claims. Wow. We've certainly covered an incredible amount of ground today. We've unpacked the foundational principles of guarantees, explored these key mechanisms like kafala and ron, and then really delved into their diverse and sometimes quite surprising applications in modern finance, from securing everyday transactions to ensuring fair play in really complex agreements.
It's truly fascinating when you dig into it. What becomes clear is that guarantees aren't just, dry legal terms buried in contracts. They are dynamic, living tools that fundamentally underpin trust and stability in our whole financial world. They're carefully designed. You can see the thought behind it to protect all the parties involved, making sure obligations are met and risks are managed in a structured, principled way that really prioritizes fairness and accountability.
Indeed. It really underscores that these aren't just rules, but tools for building a more secure and equitable financial system. So understanding these intricate safety nets, it really can empower you. Here's something to think about. How might knowing these nuances of guarantees, what's allowed, what's not, the conditions for each way, how might that change the way you evaluate financial agreements? Or maybe even how you approach your next big investment decision? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.